Howdy ESSM 406. In this lecture, we will go over Eleanor Ostrom's design principles. So in our previous lecture, we talked about how when people started looking more deeply into Garrett Hardin's work, some of it didn't make sense. Many anthropologists and others were finding many communities who were managing their resources over long periods of time successfully, without either state intervention or private property rights being imposed from the outside. So Ostrom decided to look around the world for examples of successfully managed community resources to understand, when does community management work, how does it work, and why it works. So I've given you some of the examples in your readings from her book. So in one of those examples, she talks about water management in Southern California, which is a situation analogous to overpumping of groundwater, which many of you are studying here in Texas. She shows that people in California were able to solve this problem by themselves. The government of California didn't have to come in and impose a solution. The community worked together and came up with a solution. I'm also giving you a reading by Arun Agrawal, where he talks about a similar situation with the management of forests in Nepal. So many international experts thought that the state had to manage the forest for it to be sustainable. But when the state opened up and allowed communities to manage the forest for themselves, it actually became more sustainable. So if you do the research, if you read some of the articles I've given you, you're going to find many different examples of successful situations where communities can come together to manage their resources. Now for your own policy issue, you'll have these and other examples to study to decide if a community-based management solution could be one for your problem. Now, if you read Andrews and Jansen's paper, on page 72, you will found listed 8 design principles that came from Eleanor Ostrom. Now, the design principles are derived from long-lasting systems of case studies using common pool resource governance. So I just want to discuss this with you so you understand how they all connect. Now, the very first principle we look at is for the common pool resource to have a clearly defined boundary. So the boundaries of the resource system and the individuals or households with rights to harvest or use the resource units are clearly defined. You can imagine that this can be easier in some situations over others. So the classic example of a difficult boundary to define is open ocean fisheries. And I know at least one of you is working on this situation right now. So it's not really clear where the boundaries are in the ocean, so it tends to be a little bit more of a difficult situation to manage. They also tend to be very large systems, so it's difficult to see who's using it. Now compare that to a forest near a community, so people can see who's coming and going from the forest or cutting down trees. It's also a lot easier to mark where the boundaries are on the forest, and easier if you're living near there to see who's using the resources. Now the second principle is looking at proportional equivalence between benefits and costs, with rules specifying the amount of resource products that a user is allocated, and relating it back to local conditions so that the rules requiring labor, materials, and money inputs are all included in the cost benefit. So when we look at local conditions, one of the problems is a government can't impose a rule if they don't understand the local situation. And there's no one set of rules that necessarily works everywhere. Different places have different social and cultural structures, and communities have devised different kinds of restrictions on the use of natural resources that have been tested over time. The third principle is collective choice arrangements. This is when many of the individuals affected by harvesting and protection rules are included in the group that can modify these rules. So the community needs to be a part of making the rules. That doesn't necessarily mean everyone in the community has to be on it, but there has to be enough so there's respect for the rules and they make sense in the local context. We've actually found there to be some inequality and still have a sustainable system. But many people in the community need to have access to the process of rulemaking so it's as equal as possible. One of the reasons this is important, because perhaps there's something that's not really working right in the system, and if there's no one that can communicate that to the people that are enforcing the rule, then the system's going to break down. And this happens a lot with a lot of top-down government management, because the government officials don't actually know what's going on the ground. there's also usually not enough of these people to make sure what's happening is keeping the resources sustainable. So the people that are using the resources every day are going to be much better at this and have more information. So if they have access to that decision-making authority, when they see something that's not working, they might be able to make a change. Which leads us to our next principle, which is monitoring. Monitors who actively audit biophysical conditions and user behavior are at least partially accountable to the users and or are users themselves. So that's making sure that your monitor is part of the community, not some outsider that comes in and is trying to do the monitoring. The people who are appointed to be monitors are going to be more motivated to keep those resources because they have a strong interest in keeping the resource sustainable for themselves and for their families. They know the best way to maintain those practices. And so they're going to be the ones that are going to be your best monitors. Okay, what about the people who break the rules? Because we always have rule breakers. Well, that principle is called graduated sanctions. So users who violate rules in use are likely to receive graduated sanctions, depending on the seriousness and the context of the offense, from other users, from officials accountable to these users, or from both. So we find in very successful systems, the punishment for breaking the rule once is not as severe, but perhaps it serves as a warning about proper behavior. However, if this person or this group of people are repeatedly found to be breaking the rules, then that's when you increase the sanctions on those people. Our sixth principle is having a conflict resolution mechanism in place. So this is when users and their officials have rapid access to low-cost, local action situations to resolve conflict among users or even between the users and the officials. So this is when we need to have something in place so people feel like they have a way of enforcing their rights. And this can happen through negotiations. And sometimes it's not low cost. So if you look at the example that Ostrom discusses in the reading I gave you about the groundwater management in Southern California, those differences were solved through the court system, but it ended up being a long time to solve, and it was fairly expensive. But in the end, they were able to resolve their differences, so it did work in that context. Our seventh principle is the minimal recognition of rights to organize. So this is when the rights of users to devise their own institutions are not challenged by external government authorities, and users have the long-term tenure rights to the resource. Now, this is something that's really important in developing countries because it's not uncommon at all for the national government to look down on the local people and try and say the local community doesn't have the ability to make these decisions. And this is a problem that I ran into when I was a Peace Corps volunteer. My project as a Peace Corps volunteer was to set up a protected area for wildlife in northern Ghana. Now, the national government has a really bad reputation in the north because they will often go up, displace the local monitors, bring in people from the south to do the monitoring, and completely ignore all of the governance systems that have been in place for many, many generations in that area. My Peace Corps project was going in to support the local traditional authority for them to have the rights and decision-making and enforcement over that land. And it actually ended up being a really successful project. And through the framework we created, the Wachau Community Hippo Sanctuary continues to this day to be managed by the local authorities. And it even won the Equator Prize Initiative for Grassroots Conservation by the United Nations. Now, our final principle is meant for resources that are parts of larger systems. And this involves nested enterprises. So this is when appropriation, provision, monitoring, enforcement, conflict resolution, and governance activities are organized into multiple layers of nested enterprises. So this is much more efficient in large-scale systems, meaning perhaps management is organized by neighborhood or proximity to the resource, so that everyone who's affected may still be part of all the other pieces of the design principles. Okay, so in short, those are Eleanor Ostrom's 8 design principles. highlighting common characteristics of community-managed systems that have been shown to be sustainable over long periods of time. Now, while it's not imperative that all of those principles be included to have a successful project, you need to find as many as possible. Now, when you're thinking about your own policy issue and a possible community-managed solution, you might think about how these principles work and if it's possible to implement them for your environmental management issue. How do you include the users? How do you monitor the resource? What kind of sanctions can be imposed? How do you resolve those conflicts? Now, those are some of the key decisions that you might want to think about for a sustainably managed, community-based solution. I hope that helps you understand Ostrom's design principles.